There have been some murmurs, whispers in the wind, that my tier lists are not better than getting in bed after 14 hours of physical labor, or taking a leak after holding it in for a 3-hour lecture. Actually, that's not true. Nobody has said that. In life, nothing is ever 100%, except everyone being in agreement that this is the best thing ever created. And in this video, we're going to wrap up this year's final major update. I will continue to make minor updates if any new ships make it onto the tier list, or causes big changes or whatnot, and I will also be answering questions regarding the tier lists that I get in the comments of all the tier list videos. If you want to express a disagreement with any placement, please make sure it's accompanied by at least a brief explanation. If you just say something like, Perseus A, I will respond with an equal amount of effort. Also, by popular demand, I will be dropping my carbonara recipe. It won't be in the near future, but just know it's coming. Alright, now onto the battleships. Since this is the most honest tier list, I need to say this up front. I have not been using many. No, actually, scratch that. I have not used many of the recent SSR battleships. But Jimmy, what about Rodney Meta? Are you saying that just because you have Musashi and FTG that you did not even bother to give Rodney Meta a try? Yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying. I mean, I actively avoid using battleships. Not because they're weak, by the way, they look and feel powerful, but just because I can't be asked to waste 3 seconds every time they fire their guns. If I'm leveling a new battleship, I will just give them the blue quad 356, so they fire as little as possible. Recently, I discovered that I can even farm 15-4 now just fine with a carrier-only fleet, so I won't resort to battleships even there now. Take a look at these two videos. Notice anything? In this case, the battleships were just straight up better for the fight, but let's say the two are equal in getting the job done. The battleships took over 40% more time for no good reason. All of this to say, maybe some of my opinions regarding battleships, which once upon a time were the pinnacle of true and based, may not be as true and based today. Keep in mind, that does not mean that any random who disagrees with me is more correct than me, so take in my opinion, and then take in theirs, and then make your own decision. I'm not here to hold your hands. Now, while I do try to order the ships within tiers, the best battleships in the game all offer something unique, and they're rarely in direct competition with each other. Therefore, I just tried my best to order the ships based on which uses come into play most frequently. Starting off with who I believe to be the best battleship in the game, Alsace. In terms of weaknesses, none really. She has a universal 12% damage taken debuff, so it works with any other ship regardless of hull type. It can easily be made permanent after the first reload because of how important Mogador seems to be for all kinds of boss fights. Despite it not being permanent starting from the preload, it also massively increases the damage of your Vanguard's preloaded torpedoes, which increases her value against her weakest armor type as well, which is heavy. The preload also allows her to synergize with Guam's armor break debuff, activating it as soon as the battle begins. While she's far from the best option in campaign, she's not the worst either, as she has a non-negligible heal targeted at a ship which actually needs it. Due to her high damage, universal debuff, and endless synergies, she easily finds a spot in any fleet that doesn't mind having a battleship. It doesn't matter whether her preload is being taken advantage of or not. Next up is Soyuz. She has one small weakness, which is her personal damage output against non-medium armor enemies, but she has none otherwise and a whole lot of strengths. Similar to Alsace, she plays well with any hull type. Regardless of whether she's buffing herself or acting as a carrier buffer, she is among the highest in terms of output against medium armor, and no slouch against heavy. Her Iceberg Barrage cannot physically miss, and the debuffs that come with it are always a net positive. In her battleship mode, she's pretty much an auto-include in any fight against medium armor enemies. In her carrier buffing mode, she increases Nagimov's damage by well over 20%, and that is Nagimov, who is already by far the strongest carrier against medium armor, so she's also a no-brainer. Even if she's not automatically the best option against light and heavy armor enemies, if you need a slow, she jumps to the top of the list. Due to her incredible buffs, she's also quite solid in campaign, giving ships like Nakhimov, Volga, and Kronstadt massive boosts. Next up is Bismarck Zwei. In any boss battle with more than one enemy, her black hole instantly makes her the most valuable ship in the game by far. She has top 2 DPS against light armor, losing out to just Alsace. Against medium, she used to be undisputed as well, but now suffers from heavy competition from Soyuz and Alsace. Her damage against heavy is quite lacking. The main reason that she's down in 3rd place despite how prevalent she was at one point is because of something I've mentioned previously. Her black hole can be a detriment against the stationary enemy. For example, the last meta fight against Wichita Meta should have been a layup for her, but because Wichita often stood still when the main fleet struck, when she got pulled into the black hole, it actually made her vibrate back and forth slightly, resulting in a decrease in hit rate compared to just not having the black hole. It's even more severe when using her with carriers against a stationary target, as the slight movement of being pulled into the black hole can make torpedo bombers whiff completely if not carefully timed. One last thing that puts her slightly under Soyuz for me in general is that her faction buff comes with anti-air instead of aviation. I don't know who asked for anti-air, but I can tell you for a fact that it wasn't me. Some rate her quite highly in campaign due to the unfulfilled promise auxiliary, which helps to mitigate some of the penalty from being out of ammo. Personally, I have found it to not have a huge beneficial effect and highly prefer Musashi, but you can give it a try if you're having trouble in Chapter 15 with Musashi-based fleets. Overall, Bismarck Zwei is amazing against light armor and undisputed in multiple enemy fights, but the black hole can be a detriment quite often as well, and the competition from the other battleships against other armor types has made her slip into the 3rd spot for my personal rankings. After Bismarck Zwei is Kearsarge. She's extremely good against light armor because her synergy with Yorktown 2, and syncing with her is pretty much automatic. Her aviation debuff also lasts until the next time her main gun fires, so you don't even have to sync it with other carriers necessarily. She is also great against medium armor, but I think the combination of Kearsarge plus Yorktown 2 is slightly weaker than the combination of Nakhimov plus Soyuz. Regardless, she's not as splashable as Soyuz is, who can work better in a battleship fleet than she can. Kearsarge fleets are pretty much limited to at least Yorktown 2 plus a 3rd USS ship. One last thing, her performance in campaign boss fleets should not be underestimated, and she can increase her ACV significantly while still performing like a battleship. However, her interception is lacking a bit, so keep that in mind. Next up is Musashi. After the addition of carrier Amagi, there is little reason to use her against heavy armor bosses. However, she is still by far the best ship for campaign due to her ability to absorb all damage coming at your main fleet, meaning there is zero chance your squishy healer can get randomly sniped. If your fleet is properly constructed around Musashi, it has the lowest chance of randomly dying in campaign, and it's all thanks to her. The next ship is Vanguard, who is still among the best options for a 3rd battleship in a battleship-only fleet. But unlike all of the battleships ranked above her, she can't really do much by herself, and therefore can't play with carriers. I'm also going to take this opportunity to ask, why hasn't she gotten more skins? Please, a date skin, sleepwear skin, magical girl skin, anything. After Vanguard, there is an invisible line. I originally wanted to put these last 3 battleships in a lower tier, but there was not enough tiers to do so, as the tier list maker doesn't have the functionality to add or remove tiers yet. While they are a step down from the other UR battleships, they are much closer to them than the SSR battleships in A. If possible, I would put them in S-. Although UVH has less raw power than FDG and New Jersey, her kit makes her a standout in Chapter 14 boss fights. Firstly, her constant firing means that she quickly reveals herself. Although she is not squishy by any means, she can still easily get sniped by the battleships in Chapter 14 boss fights, but if you combine her with Seydlitz or Musashi, all of a sudden it turns into a completely controlled situation with no RNG. Additionally, because you have to chew through many mobs before reaching the final boss, her damage uptime is a hugely valuable asset to have. Finally, her cross-fleet barrage is the best cross-fleet barrage for interception, and Chapter 14 mob fights have the most need for interception. Every part of her kit contributes in some way that other ships cannot in Chapter 14 boss fights, giving her a niche use case. Next, FTG is no slouch and still likely tied for the second best campaign mobbing battleship with Alsace, Soyuz, and Bismarck Zwei, but she offers nothing else over the ships above her, and is still a pretty significant step down from Musashi due to the lack of the damage reduction property which Musashi has. Finally, we have New Jersey. Her greatest strength is single target damage output, and she's completely outclassed by the ships in the top 6 in that department. Her barrage, while strong, can't even begin to compare to the barrages of ships like Bismarck Zwei and Musashi, and it also has a hard time hitting moving targets, unlike Soyuz's. It comes with an armor break debuff, which is significantly weaker than literally every other debuff that the top 6 battleships provide. There is also no top-of-the-line Eagle Union battleships to benefit from her firepower buff, and even if there were, the buff is still significantly weaker than all the other buffers. The reasons she's lower than FTG and DUVH, despite being likely stronger in a vacuum, is because her kit is just too vanilla, and therefore has no real niche use cases. It's not just 1 or 2 ships that stole her job, more like 5 of them. She still has the extra barrage at 10 seconds, I guess, so if you're doing fights that are shorter than 30 seconds, she can outdamage everyone other than Alsace, but how often is that going to be a determining factor for an ultra-rare battleship? As we move away from the S tier, there is quite a big gap in power. Also, everyone knows the UR battleships are better than the non-UR ones, so this is really where my personal bias kicks in heavily. I have decided to put ships that are not necessarily the strongest damage-wise on average, but rather ships that offer something unique and useful, which set them aside from others. First up in the A tier are Izumo and Flandre. These two are the most solid and reliable ships for AoE and single target damage after the URs. However, the difference between Izumo and, say, Prinz Rupprecht or Marco Polo is smaller than the difference between Izumo and FTG, but Izumo earns a higher spot due to her barrage being guaranteed, which is a huge quality of life increase over RNG barrages. As for Flandre, she is a solid high damage single target ship with a preload and doesn't sacrifice really anything to compensate for it like many preloaded battleships before her. After that, we have Odin. She has a bunch of little special effects that add up, including a strong ghost ox gun, torpedo damage reduction for the Vanguard, and a powerful barrage. But her real selling point is the positional gimmick that puts her in the same special position regardless of what spot she is placed in the main fleet. This means that as long as she's not revealed, when enemy battleships in Chapter 14 aim their shelling in the general direction of where she should be, she completely avoids the damage. It also means that you can use a carrier as your flagship and still have interception from the center because she always sits in the middle. In terms of viable off-flag battleships and battlecruisers for Campaign Go, she's one of the last non-UR ships worth considering. Next is Duke of York. Since UR battleships are just much stronger than gold ones, Duke of York gets much more value as a cheerleader for URs as opposed to just being a worse version of them. Well, she is mostly a worse version of Vanguard, but still, being a universal debuffer makes her a much better temporary slot for bossing fleets than other gold ships. Next is Hood. Many people will disagree with this placement because Hood's personal damage output is underwhelming, even compared to other SSRs. And due to having a destroyer gun as her secondary, her interception is not the best, but it is acceptable. They also do not rate her reload buff at all, but I do. If the way you compare ships is to just toss them in the same fleet with the same 5 other ships without regard for the different strengths of the ships you're testing, then it's no surprise Hood performs worse. However, her reload buff does make a difference, and if you're using her, you should use ships with higher damage on strike, but normally longer cooldowns. In boss fights, it's very realistic to get an extra airstrike or battleship salvo from your other main fleet ships thanks to her reload buff. Although not strong, she also doesn't have large deficiencies against any specific armor type, unlike most ships with AP barrages that deal poor damage against light armor, or Marco Polo who runs into a brick wall against heavy armor enemies. Her consistency, well-roundedness, and reload buff is why I put her as high as I did. Next up is Gascogne, who also has a 100% chance to activate barrage, but not tied to her main guns. For some, this means higher damage uptime, but damage uptime is a function of the entire fleet, so it can also be a detriment because you cannot control it as you wish. To me, this is simply a trade-off. Although only having 2 main gun mounts as opposed to the usual 3, her guns always focus the priority target, which is yet another trade-off. She's another solid campaign mobbing flagship, but just pay attention to her quirks when building a fleet around her, meaning choose ships that are better at cleaning up lower priority enemies, and avoid stacking too much damage at the 20-second interval. Next up is Nagato META, who functions very similarly to Izumo, but a bigger portion of her barrage is straight shelling compared to Izumo, which is not a good thing because it gets stopped by shields. She's likely better than Izumo if there are an abundance of light armor enemies though, and she's very powerful and consistent regardless of whether you run her with IJN ships or not. Next up are the 3 best SSR faction buffers. Richelieu is kind of in right now because of Alsace and Mogador, while Nagato is pretty much out because Tamaki took her usual spot. Vittorio Veneto is in limbo because there simply aren't Sardinia ships worth using for her buffs. Aquila, for example, is used for her heal and shield, which Veneto does not affect. And while Veneto's evasion buff is what makes her buffs stand out despite having much lower numbers offensively, Napoli is the last ship that needs more evasion. If they had a ship like Hindenburg, then we would be talking. If you look at her as where she fits in the meta, she would definitely be overrated here. However, I'm placing her here more of a reminder that her kit is not bad at all, and she's also super hot. One last thing, new ships aside, why haven't Veneto and Zara gotten any skins since release? What skin line would they not look good in? It's not like their artist is in limbo either. Surely they're more deserving than 99% of Ironblood and Northern Parliament ships. Yup, I said it. These three faction buffers are not necessarily better than the ships in B tier in most cases, but because they enable different team comps that function almost as well as optimal fleets, I placed them higher. The last ship in A tier is Seydlitz, who can still eliminate all RNG from your Chapter 14 boss fleets if you're missing Musashi, something which no other SSR battleship or battlecruiser can claim to do. Now we move on to the B tier. Keep in mind that the gap between A and B is smaller than the gap between A and S. Tamaki is just a straightforward battleship with good stats and a good barrage. Her barrage is single target focused and has random targeting, neither of which is ideal for campaign, but she's still no slouch. I think she is inferior against single enemies compared to Flandre and Duke of York though. Next, both Marco Polo and Prinz Rupprecht are strong flagship choices for campaign. They can steamroll fights harder than A tiers that function the same role, but there's no reason to roll the dice on their chance-based barrages when you have plenty of choices with guaranteed barrages. Next up is Monarch. Her barrage is brilliant against any non-light armor enemy, and her weakness is that she has a 30% chance on fire to be one of the weakest gold battleships in the game. Next is the original Bismarck. As a standalone ship, she is not as good as the other old faction buffers, but Ironblood has many powerful ships that can make use of her buffs. Next is Queen Elizabeth META. She just has decent stats and a guaranteed barrage. Any ship that is about this strong or weaker will not make the cut. The final ships in the official tiers are going to be the big 7 retrofits. They're easily obtainable early on in the game and can bring you past Chapter 14 of campaign. If a campaign-oriented battleship can't outperform them significantly, they're not getting onto the tier list. Keep in mind that there are 4 of them, and you only really need one of the 4. There are also upgrades which are not much more difficult to obtain, like Hood and Nagato META. I put Nelson first because the barrage is more or less guaranteed. The USS ones are stronger on average, but they can and will underperform. If you're watching the battle and reset when they fail to proc their barrages, it should be fine, but it's not fine if you're full auto farming a relatively difficult stage for your progression. Now, I'll just briefly talk about the ships I haven't used enough to have an informed opinion. For Dyson and Owari, I find most parts of their barrages to be too focused to be effective in campaign. I think both of them could be very potent in boss fights, especially against light armor enemies, as their barrages are skewed toward light armor. They are likely A tier ships, as I feel their damage should be closer to Flandre than Tamaki, for example. If you want to remove rainbows from the picture, they are better than Duke of York, but if you have like 2 URs and you're looking for an SSR battleship to fill the last slot, then it's gotta be Duke of York all the way. Constellation, on the other hand, is much more suited for campaign, because of her little swirly attack that hits multiple enemies as many times as it passes through them. She's definitely better than the Big 7 retrofit, but I don't know by exactly how much and whether or not it's enough for A tier. The next 3 collab battleships are all very solid and reliable. The thing about collab ships in general is that they're often good enough above the average to be proper filler for new players who get lured in by the other franchises, but they're not going to replace your top options. If you like any of these franchises and have the ships as well as their unique augments, I would give them a shot. All 3 excel in campaign and should be better than the Big 7 retrofit. If you don't have the ships, well, you don't have to worry about a thing. Next up are a couple of the better meta battleships. PA Meta has a pretty strong guaranteed barrage on paper, and her skills make her tankier than her stats suggest. Rodney Meta has a really solid barrage, but only with an 80% activation rate. I would say Rodney Meta could be mid B tier, while Hiei Meta could be an A tier, but I honestly have no clue. The biggest problem when it comes to new meta ships is the fact that I often forget to level their skills. Okay, I'm done. There currently seems to be a war zone going on in the carrier tier list comment section right now. I'll let it stew for a few more days before I go through and make a response video. I might have to split them into multiple parts because the questions are piling up, but it'll come. Feel free to leave your questions and disagreements with this tier list as well. With that being said, thanks for watching and see you in the next one.